In this lesson, I want to show you the most common problem that people have when they're using a sensor to control a loop. Here's a program that we wrote for an earlier lesson. We start out by having the motors moving unlimited, so we start our motors moving, and then we go into this loop. The loop is actually controlled by an ultrasonic sensor that keeps going in the loop until we're less than 25 centimeters away. And while we're in the loop, we're playing this little tune, and we play 3 different notes for 1/10 of a second each. So we keep playing those notes until we detect that we're within 25 centimeters or less of an object. Well, we're less than 25 centimeters from an object, at which point we stop the motors and say object detected. Okay, I'm actually going to change this distance to 30 centimeters because I brought a ruler with me today and I just want to show you what's happening. And my ruler is roughly 30 centimeters long, so let me just update that comment too. So that says waiting until less than 30 centimeters. Okay, let's just run it one time to remind ourselves what happens. Okay, so here's my ruler that's roughly 30 centimeters long, and let's give it a go. It's not perfect, but remember my ruler's a little bit longer than 30 centimeters and we're measuring from the sonar, so let's give it a little bit of a break and say that that's 30 centimeters. Okay, so for that example, I had each note play for a pretty short time, only 1/10 of a second. What if we changed it to a whole second per note? So let's make that 1 second, and I'll just hit tab to make sure it gets entered. And that 1 second, and you can hit tab or the enter key, both of them work. And this one also for 1 second. Okay, let's run it again and see what happens. Okay, so let's try this. That was pretty good. To make a point, I'm just going to try it one more time, and let's see what happens this time. That wasn't quite so good. Okay, so in that first demo, the robot stopped at roughly 30 centimeters. But in the second demo, it took it a while for it to stop. Do you understand why that happened? Let's trace our program to find out. Here's a copy of our code. To show you exactly why the robot behaved in the way it did, it'll help us to keep track of what the ultrasonic sensor reading is every step of the way. Note that the NXT only pays attention to that reading sometimes, but for our purposes, let's keep an eye on it. So let's suppose that when we begin the program, there's actually an object at around 65 centimeters in front of the robot. We start the program, and this first block tells us to turn on the power to the motors. So the NXT does that, and then continues on to the next block. We arrive at the entrance to the loop, and it says, "Welcome, come in." Note that all of the steps that have happened so far are processed so quickly that I'm going to assume we haven't really moved much, if at all. So now we go into the loop, and our motors are running when we arrive at that first sound block and play the note for a full second. So that by the time we actually arrive at the second note, let's say we're 10 centimeters closer to the obstacle. So now it's only 55 centimeters away. We continue to move while we play the next note for a second, and let's suppose we're 45 centimeters away from the obstacle by the time we begin playing that third note. We're still moving as we reach the end of the loop, so maybe at this point the obstacle's 35 centimeters away. Now we have to check whether the ultrasonic sensor detects that there's an object less than 30 centimeters away. We're actually 35 centimeters away, so the loop will say, "Do it again." That sonar check took virtually no time, so we're probably still about 35 centimeters away from the obstacle as we play this note. And perhaps when we start playing this note, we're 25 centimeters away. But we're inside the loop now. There's no check of the distance at this point, so we just continue moving and playing our note. Now we're only 15 centimeters away, but still no check, so we keep moving and playing. Finally, we reach the end of the loop, and it's time to check the ultrasonic sensor. And we're definitely much closer than 30 centimeters away from the obstacle, so the loop tells us to go away. The NXT stops its motors. Note that we're only around 5 centimeters away from the obstacle at this point. And the NXT says object detected, and then we're finished the program. In many ways, using a sensor-based loop is similar to using a loop based on time. You're always going to do every step in the loop before you check the sensor, no matter what your sensor happens to notice in the meantime. If you think about it, this could be a particular problem with the touch sensor. To make things really simple, let's get rid of all the movement on this loop. I'll just delete that one. And I'm also going to delete this stop at the end because we don't need that anymore. And let's just stick with the sound in this loop. And let's wait for a button press. So the touch sensor, wait for a press. And I guess I better get rid of these comments. So I'll click on them and then hit delete. We can keep. There we go. Let's suppose that as we go through this loop, we press the button on the first note and keep holding it pressed while we play the other notes. Then when we check the sensor at the end of the loop, the button is pressed, and so we'll leave the loop and the NXT says object detected, and we're done. So that worked well. But suppose that we had pressed the button during the first note and then released it during the second note. Then, by the time we did the check at the end of the loop, the sensor would report that the button was not pressed, so we'd have to do the loop again. A lot of the time, what you actually want to know is whether the button's been pressed at all in the past, even if it was pressed and then released, instead of whether it's currently pressed. LEGO uses the term bump to refer to the act of both pressing and then releasing the button on the touch sensor. Okay, so let's take this loop where we were waiting until the button was pressed. So we're repeating the loop again and again until the button is pressed, and we're going to change it so that we repeat the loop again and again until the button is bumped. Whenever you have a touch sensor in your program, the NXT keeps track of whether that sensor has been pressed and released since you last checked. Both the press and release and the since you last checked are important. Suppose we press the button. Has the sensor been bumped yet? No, because you need a press and a release. Okay, so suppose we release the button. Now has the sensor been bumped? Yeah, you had a press and a release, so now you've been bumped. And what if we ask again right away whether the sensor's been bumped? Well, now the answer is no, because we haven't been bumped again since the last time we checked. So you should imagine that as we start our program, the NXT keeps a note that the touch sensor has not yet been bumped. So let's imagine we press the button on the touch sensor, just as that first note is being played. And note that the touch sensor is now pressed, but since bump is defined as being pressed and then released, the sensor still hasn't been bumped. Okay, so let's suppose we release the button as the second note is being played. And now the button on the touch sensor has been both pressed and released, and so the NXT makes a note that a bump has happened. We continue on with the rest of our program, and when we reach the end of the loop, and we check at that point whether or not the button has been bumped, the answer is yes. Note that as soon as we check the sensor, the NXT now says that the sensor has not been bumped, since it hasn't been bumped again since we last checked it. So now we leave the loop and finish up the program. Let's just do that one more time, okay?